The sun blazed mercilessly over Dodge City, Kansas, in the summer of 1886. Dust devils danced through the main street as Silas Monroe rode into town on his weathered bay horse, his dark coat trailing behind him like a shadow. At 43, Silas carried the weight of countless miles and buried secrets in his steel-gray eyes. His reputation preceded him, a man who spoke little, trusted less, and had a peculiar talent for finding trouble where others saw only opportunity. "Hi, how are you? Sorry to interrupt your story, but what I'm going to ask you is really quick, and it will really help the channel to grow and create new stories. Just click below the video image to subscribe. You'll be doing an act of kindness and encouragement to those who are just starting out. Thank you very much, and continue with your story." Silas dismounted outside Murphy's saloon, his spurs jingling against the wooden boardwalk. The townspeople gave him a wide berth, whispering among themselves about the stranger with the twin colts and the haunted expression. He'd come to Dodge City for supplies and a night's rest, nothing more. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. As he secured his horse to the hitching post, a small figure darted between the buildings. A girl, no more than 12, with tangled auburn hair and tears streaming down her dirt-stained cheeks. She collided with Silas, nearly knocking herself to the ground. "Easy there, little miss," Silas said, his voice gravelly from years of prairie wind and sparse conversation. He steadied the girl with gentle hands, noting the desperation in her wide green eyes. "Please, mister," Abigail gasped, clutching at his coat sleeve. "You gotta help me find my brother Tommy. They took him to the orphanage, but something ain't right about that place. The children, they disappear." Silas studied the girl's face, seeing something that stirred memories he'd rather keep buried. "What's your name, child?" "Abigail Hartwell. My pa died in a mining accident 3 months ago, and Ma, she got the fever last week. Tommy's only 8, and when the town council came for us, they said we'd be better off at Dove Creek Orphanage. But I heard things, mister. Terrible things." The mention of Dove Creek Orphanage caused several passers-by to quicken their pace, their faces darkening. Silas noticed their reactions, filing the information away like a poker player reading tells. "What kind of things?" he asked, crouching to meet Abigail's eyes. "Children going in but never coming out. Wagons leaving at night with covered cargo. And Reverend Barton," she shuddered. "There's something wrong with his eyes, like he's looking right through you to count your worth." Before Silas could respond, a portly man in a sheriff's badge approached. Sheriff Cornelius Wade had the look of a man who'd grown comfortable with compromise, his belly straining against his vest and his eyes avoiding direct contact. "Now, Abigail," Wade said with forced joviality, "you know you shouldn't be bothering strangers with your wild stories. The Reverend and Mrs. Eleanor are good Christian folks doing the Lord's work." "Sheriff," Silas stood slowly, his hand resting casually near his gun belt. "The girl seems distressed about her brother. Tommy's fine, just fine. Adjusting to his new home, that's all. Children often get confused during times of grief." Wade's smile never reached his eyes. "Perhaps you'd best move along, stranger. Dodge City's a peaceful town, and we aim to keep it that way." The threat was subtle, but unmistakable. Silas had encountered corrupt lawmen before, and Wade bore all the hallmarks: the nervous fidgeting, the rehearsed responses, the way his eyes darted toward the orphanage at the edge of town. "I reckon I'll be staying a few days," Silas replied evenly. "See what this peaceful town has to offer." As Wade departed with obvious reluctance, Abigail tugged at Silas's sleeve again. "You believe me, don't you? About Tommy?" Silas looked down at the girl, seeing echoes of another child from long ago, his own sister, Sarah, who'd disappeared when he was barely older than Abigail. He'd failed Sarah, but maybe he could do right by this girl. "I believe you're scared for your brother," he said carefully. "And that's enough for now." That evening, Silas sat in Murphy's saloon, nursing a whiskey and listening to the local gossip. The bartender, a grizzled man named Frank Murphy, proved more talkative than most. "You asking about the orphanage?" Murphy wiped down a glass with practiced efficiency. "Been here 20 years, and I've seen plenty of strange things. But lately," he glanced around nervously, Lately, it's like the whole town's walking on eggshells around that place. How so? Well, take the Hendricks family. Lost both parents to cholera last spring. 3 children went to Dove Creek. Within a month, all 3 had been adopted by families out east. Funny thing is, nobody ever saw these adopting families, and the children never wrote back. Silas leaned forward. That strike you as odd? Plenty odd. But Reverend Barton's got connections with the territorial government, and his wife, Eleanor, she's got a way of making people forget their questions. Money talks loud in a town like this. As Murphy spoke, a well-dressed woman entered the saloon, an unusual sight in such an establishment. Clara Dawson carried herself with the confidence of someone accustomed to challenging conventions. Her dark hair was pinned back severely, and her intelligent brown eyes missed nothing. "Mr. Murphy," she said crisply, "I'll have a coffee if you please, and perhaps this gentleman wouldn't mind some company." Silas gestured to the chair across from him. "Ma'am, Clara Dawson, Dodge City Herald," she introduced herself, extending a firm handshake. "I understand you've been asking questions about our local orphanage. Word travels fast in a small town. Indeed, it does, especially when those questions concern matters I've been investigating myself." Clara's voice dropped to a whisper. "I've been documenting irregularities at Dove Creek for months. Missing children, forged adoption papers, and financial discrepancies that would make your head spin. Why hasn't this been reported?" Clara's laugh was bitter. "To whom? Sheriff Wade? The territorial authorities who received generous donations from the orphanage's board? I'm a woman reporter in 1886, Mr. Monroe. My credibility extends only as far as society recipes and church socials. You know my name. I make it my business to know everyone who passes through Dodge City, especially those with your reputation for justice." Silas studied the woman across from him. Clara Dawson radiated determination and intelligence, but also frustration, the kind that came from knowing the truth but being powerless to act on it. "What exactly are you proposing, Miss Dawson?" "Partnership. You have the skills and reputation to go places I cannot. I have information and resources you'll need. Together, we might actually save those children." Before Silas could respond, the saloon doors burst open. Deputy Matthew Price stumbled in, his young face pale and his hands shaking. At 25, Price still believed in justice, though that faith was being sorely tested. "Frank," Price called out, "whiskey, make it a double." Clara and Silas exchanged glances. Price was known as one of the few honest lawmen in the territory, which made his obvious distress significant. "Deputy," Clara approached him carefully, "you look like you've seen a ghost." Price's laugh was hollow. "Worse than a ghost, Miss Dawson. I've seen the truth." He downed his whiskey in one gulp. "I was doing rounds tonight, checking the perimeter roads, when I saw a wagon leaving Dove Creek. Covered wagon, moving fast and quiet." "That's not unusual," Clara prompted gently. "It is when you hear children crying from inside." Price's voice cracked. "I tried to follow, but they had too much of a head start. By the time I reached the crossroads, they'd vanished into the night." The saloon fell silent, except for the ticking of the wall clock. Silas felt the familiar weight of decisions settling on his shoulders, the moment when a man chooses between walking away and walking into hell. "Deputy," Silas said quietly, "you willing to do what's right, even if it means going against your sheriff?" Price met his gaze, and Silas saw the same determination that had once driven him to pin on a badge in another life, in another town that had needed saving. "Those children deserve better than what they're getting," Price said firmly. "Whatever it takes." As the 3 unlikely allies sat in the flickering lamplight of Murphy's saloon, none of them could have imagined the horrors they would uncover in the coming days. But they had taken the first step down a path that would lead them into the darkest corners of human greed and cruelty. Outside, the wind carried the faint sound of children's voices from the direction of Dove Creek Orphanage, voices that seemed to be calling for help in the Kansas night. The hunt for the truth had begun. Dawn broke gray and ominous over Dodge City as Silas Monroe prepared for his reconnaissance of Dove Creek Orphanage. The previous night's conversation with Clara Dawson and Deputy Matthew Price had crystallized his resolve, but years of survival had taught him the value of careful observation before action. Silas positioned himself on a ridge overlooking the orphanage, using a spyglass borrowed from Clara's newspaper office. The building itself was imposing, a three-story structure of red brick and white trim that spoke of substantial funding. Too substantial, perhaps, for a frontier orphanage. Through his lens, Silas observed the morning routine. Children emerged for breakfast, but something was wrong with the scene. The kids moved with mechanical precision, their faces blank and fearful. No laughter, no play, just silent compliance that chilled him to the bone. Reverend Barton appeared on the front steps, a tall man with silver hair and the kind of smile that never reached his eyes. Even from a distance, Silas could see the calculating way the man surveyed his charges, like a rancher counting livestock. "Seen enough?" Clara's voice startled him. She'd approached with the stealth of someone accustomed to gathering information undetected. "How'd you find me?" "I'm a reporter, Mr. Monroe. Finding people is what I do." Clara settled beside him, producing her own small telescope. "Besides, this is my usual observation post. I've been watching that place for 3 months." "What have you learned?" Clara opened a leather portfolio filled with notes and sketches. "The orphanage receives children from across Kansas territory, but the adoption rate is impossibly high. According to their records, 90% of children are placed within 6 weeks. That's unheard of. Maybe they're just efficient. Or maybe they're not actually adoptions." Clara pointed to a series of dates and numbers. "I've cross-referenced their claimed adoptions with territorial records. Half the adopting families don't exist, and the other half are shell companies registered to the same address, a warehouse in Kansas City." Silas studied the documents, his expression darkening. "You think they're selling the children? I think they're running the most sophisticated child trafficking operation in the territory, and I think they have protection from people who should be stopping them." As if summoned by their conversation, a familiar figure appeared at the orphanage gates. Sheriff Wade rode up in his buggy, dismounting with the casual familiarity of a regular visitor. Through the spyglass, Silas watched Wade hand Reverend Barton an envelope thick enough to contain money. "Well, that answers one question," Silas muttered. "Wade's been making those visits twice a month for the past year," Clara confirmed. "Always with an envelope, always staying exactly 15 minutes. Their surveillance was interrupted by the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Deputy Price rode up the ridge, his face grim with new information. "We've got problems," he announced without preamble. "I did some digging into those adoption records Clara mentioned. Found something interesting in the telegraph office." Price dismounted and pulled out a crumpled telegram. "This came in yesterday, addressed to Reverend Barton. It's from someone called the Broker in Kansas City." Clara snatched the telegram, her eyes widening as she read. "Shipment of 12, ready for transport. Buyers confirmed for Saturday delivery. Premium prices for younger specimens. Ensure merchandise is clean and compliant." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Silas felt his jaw clench as the full scope of the operation became clear. These weren't adoptions. They were sales. Human beings, children, reduced to merchandise. "There's more," Price continued. "I checked the orphanage's supply orders. They've been purchasing laudanum in quantities that would sedate a small army. And their food orders? They're feeding twice as many children as they claim to house." "Hidden children," Clara breathed. "They're keeping some off the books." Silas lowered his spyglass, his mind racing through possibilities. "We need to get inside that building. See what they're hiding." "That's suicide," Price protested. "The place is guarded, and if Wade's involved, we can't trust anyone in law enforcement." "Then we don't involve law enforcement?" "Not yet." Silas turned to Clara. "You mentioned financial irregularities. What kind?" Clara flipped through her notes. "The orphanage receives funding from 3 sources: territorial appropriations, church donations, and something called the Children's Welfare Foundation. That last one is interesting. It's registered in Denver, but I can't find any record of its actual activities." "Shell organization," Silas concluded. "Probably how they launder the money from sales." "But here's the really interesting part," Clara continued. The Foundation's board includes some very prominent names: Territorial Judge Harrison Blackwood, Railroad Baron William Ashford, and, she paused dramatically, Senator Charles Whitmore. The implications hit them like a physical blow. This wasn't just a local operation. It was connected to the highest levels of territorial government. No wonder Sheriff Wade felt secure in his corruption. "We're not just fighting an orphanage," Price said quietly. "We're fighting the entire power structure of Kansas territory." "Then we better be smart about it," Silas replied. "Clara, I need you to send some telegrams, discreet inquiries to newspapers in other territories. See if there are similar operations elsewhere." "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking this is bigger than Dodge City. If we're right about the scope, there might be other reporters, other lawmen who've noticed patterns." As they planned their next moves, a commotion erupted at the orphanage below. Through their telescopes, they watched as a wagon arrived. Not the usual supply wagon, but something more sinister. The driver was a hard-faced man with the look of someone comfortable with violence. "That's Jake Morrison," Price identified grimly. "Bounty hunter, gun for hire. What's he doing at an orphanage?" Their question was answered moments later when Morrison emerged from the building, roughly escorting a boy of about 10. The child was fighting, trying to break free, but Morrison's grip was iron. Even from their distance, they could hear the boy's cries. "Tommy," Clara whispered, recognizing the auburn hair that matched Abigail's. "That's Abigail's brother." Silas was already moving, sliding down the ridge toward his horse. "They're moving him. We follow that wagon." "Silas, wait," Clara called. "We need a plan." "The plan is simple," he called back. "We don't let that boy disappear." The chase that followed tested every skill Silas had learned in his years as a drifter and former lawman. Morrison's wagon moved fast, taking back roads and cattle trails that suggested intimate knowledge of the territory. Silas followed at a distance, using natural cover to avoid detection. The wagon's destination proved to be an abandoned mining camp 15 miles outside Dodge City. Silas watched from concealment as Morrison delivered Tommy to a larger operation, a staging area where other children were being held in what appeared to be converted mining shacks. Through his spyglass, Silas counted at least 20 children, all between the ages of 6 and 14. They were guarded by 3 armed men and supervised by a woman whose cold efficiency reminded him unpleasantly of Eleanor Barton. As he observed, a pattern emerged. The children were being sorted, the younger ones separated from the older, boys from girls. Each group was tagged with colored ribbons, like cattle being prepared for market. The sight filled Silas with a rage he hadn't felt since Sarah's disappearance 25 years ago. These children weren't just being sold, they were being categorized for different types of buyers, different purposes. The implications made his stomach turn. A sound behind him made Silas spin, hand moving to his gun. But it was Deputy Price having followed his trail. "Jesus Christ," Price breathed, seeing the camp. "How many children are down there?" "Too many. And this is just one staging area. There could be others." Price pulled out a small notebook, sketching the layout of the camp. "We need evidence, something that will convince the territorial authorities." "The territorial authorities are part of this," Silas reminded him. "We're on our own." As they watched, a new wagon arrived, this one carrying supplies and what appeared to be travel documents. Silas recognized the driver as one of Reverend Barton's assistants from the orphanage. "They're preparing to move them," Price observed. "Probably to Kansas City, based on that telegram." "When?" "Saturday, according to the message. That gives us 3 days. 3 days to plan a rescue operation against overwhelming odds, with no official support and enemies in positions of power." Silas had faced worse odds before, but never with so many innocent lives hanging in the balance. As they prepared to withdraw, a child's scream echoed across the camp. One of the younger boys had tried to run and was being dragged back by his hair. The casual brutality of the scene crystallized Silas's resolve. "We're going to need help," he told Price. "More than just the 3 of us." "What kind of help?" "The kind that doesn't ask questions and doesn't care about territorial politics." Silas mounted his horse, his face set in grim determination. I know some people. Men who understand that some fights are worth having, regardless of the odds. As they rode back toward Dodge City, neither man spoke of the magnitude of what they were planning, but both understood that they had crossed a line. There would be no walking away now, no pretending they hadn't seen what they'd seen. The children in that camp were counting on them, whether they knew it or not. And Silas Monroe had never been one to let children down. Not again. The abandoned church on the outskirts of Dodge City had seen better days. Its weathered walls and broken windows made it the perfect meeting place for conspirators planning to challenge the most powerful men in Kansas territory. As midnight approached, Silas Monroe waited in the shadows, listening for the approach of the allies he'd summoned. The first to arrive was Marcus Bear Thompson, a mountain of a man with graying hair and scars that told stories of a dozen frontier conflicts. Bear had ridden with Silas during their days as territorial marshals, before corruption and politics had driven them both to seek justice outside the law. "Silas," Bear's voice rumbled like distant thunder as he dismounted. "Got your message. Figured you'd eventually find trouble worth sharing." "Bear," Silas clasped his old friend's hand. "Thanks for coming." "Children in danger? Hell, you know I can't walk away from that." Bear's expression darkened. "Reminds me too much of what happened to my own boy." The second arrival was unexpected. A woman dressed in men's clothing, her long black hair braided down her back. Elena Vasquez moved with the fluid grace of someone equally comfortable with a rifle or a blade. She'd been a scout for the cavalry before deserting over their treatment of Indian children. "Monroe," she nodded curtly. "I hear you're planning something foolish." "Foolish, but necessary," Silas replied. "Elena, meet Bear Thompson. Bear, Elena Vasquez, best tracker in 3 territories. And the most wanted," Elena added with a sardonic smile. "The cavalry doesn't appreciate deserters, even ones with good reasons." The final member of their unlikely team arrived as the church bell tolled midnight. James "Doc" Holliday, not the famous gunfighter, but a former Army medic who'd earned his nickname patching up wounded soldiers and outlaws alike. Doc was thin and pale, with the hollow cough of a man fighting consumption, but his hands were steady and his courage unquestioned. "Gentlemen, lady," Doc tipped his hat to Elena. "I understand we're planning to liberate some children from very dangerous people." "That's the idea," Silas confirmed. "But first, let me bring you up to speed on what we're facing." For the next hour, Silas, Clara, and Deputy Price laid out everything they'd discovered. The scope of the operation, the involvement of territorial officials, the staging camp, and the planned Saturday transport to Kansas City. With each revelation, the faces of their allies grew grimmer. "So we're not just fighting kidnappers," Bear summarized. "We're fighting a network that reaches all the way to the territorial capital." "And probably beyond," Clara added. "I received responses to my telegrams today. Similar operations have been reported in Colorado, Nebraska, and New Mexico territories. Always the same pattern: orphanages with impossibly high adoption rates, children disappearing, and local officials looking the other way." Elena studied the map of the staging camp that Price had sketched. 20 children, 4 guards, defensible position. It's doable, but we'll need to be smart about it. "The real problem isn't the rescue," Doc observed. "It's what happens after. These people have the resources to hunt us across the territory. We save the children, but then what? Where do they go?" It was a sobering question. Even if they successfully liberated the children, they'd be fugitives with no legal protection and nowhere to run. "I might have an answer to that," Clara said quietly. "I've been corresponding with a reporter in Denver, Sarah Mitchell of the Rocky Mountain News. She's been investigating similar operations and has connections with federal marshals who aren't compromised." "Federal involvement?" Price looked hopeful. "That could change everything." "Maybe, but it would take time to coordinate, and those children don't have time. The transport leaves Saturday." Silas had been silent during this exchange, staring at the crude map of the staging camp. Finally, he looked up at his assembled team. "We hit them tomorrow night," he decided. "Friday, one day before the transport. That gives us the element of surprise and time to get the children to safety before anyone realizes what's happened. And then? Bear asked. Then we go after the real prize, the orphanage itself. We get evidence that will bring down the whole network. Eleanor shook her head. You're talking about a war, Monroe. These people won't just roll over because we rescued some children. Then it's a war, Silas replied grimly. Some things are worth fighting for. The next day passed in tense preparation. Silas and his team scouted escape routes, gathered supplies, and refined their plan. Clara worked her network of contacts, sending coded messages to sympathetic newspapers across the territory. Deputy Price used his position to gather intelligence on the movements of Sheriff Wade and the orphanage staff. As evening approached, troubling news arrived. Abigail Hartwell burst into Clara's newspaper office, her face streaked with tears and her dress torn. "Miss Dawson," she gasped. "They came for me. Sheriff Wade and 2 men from the orphanage. I barely got away." Clara quickly ushered the girl into the back room where Silas was reviewing maps. "What happened, child?" "They said I was spreading lies about the orphanage, that I needed to be corrected. But I heard them talking. They know someone's been watching them. They're moving the children tonight instead of Saturday." The news hit the room like a thunderbolt. Their carefully laid plans were suddenly worthless. "How long ago was this?" Silas demanded. "Maybe an hour. I ran all the way here." Silas was already moving, grabbing his gun belt and hat. "We move now. No time for careful planning." "Silas, wait!" Clara caught his arm. "This could be a trap. They might be using the girl to draw you out." Silas looked down at Abigail, seeing the genuine terror in her eyes. "Maybe, but I'm not willing to bet those children's lives on it." Within 30 minutes, the team was mounted and riding hard toward the staging camp. The sun was setting, painting the Kansas sky blood red, an ominous portent for the night ahead. They reached the ridge overlooking the camp just as the first wagons were being loaded. Through his spyglass, Silas could see the children being herded into covered wagons like cattle. Some were crying, others seemed drugged into compliance. 4 wagons, Eleanor reported. 8 guards that I can see, probably more. We're outnumbered 2 to 1, Bear observed. And they have hostages. Then we even the odds, Silas replied. He turned to Doc. Can you create a distraction? Something to draw some of them away? Doc grinned, producing a stick of dynamite from his saddlebags. I was saving this for a special occasion. The plan was simple and desperate. Doc would circle around to the old mine shaft and create an explosion, drawing the guards away from the wagons. In the confusion, Silas, Bear, and Elena would hit the camp from 3 directions, while Price and Clara waited with fresh horses for the escape. As they prepared to move, Silas felt the familiar weight of impending violence. He'd killed before, in the line of duty and in defense of the innocent. But tonight felt different. Tonight, he wasn't just fighting criminals. He was fighting a system that had failed the most vulnerable. Remember, he told his team, the children are the priority. We get them out, whatever the cost. The explosion, when it came, lit up the night sky like a miniature sun. Doc had placed his charge perfectly, bringing down part of the mine shaft in a spectacular display of fire and falling rock. Immediately, half the guards ran toward the disturbance, leaving the wagons lightly defended. Silas spurred his horse down the slope, his Colts already in his hands. The remaining guards were caught completely off guard, expecting trouble from the direction of the explosion, not from the ridge behind them. The gunfight was brief but vicious. Bear's shotgun roared like thunder, dropping 2 guards before they could draw their weapons. Elena's rifle spoke with deadly precision, each shot finding its mark. Silas rode straight into the center of the camp, his guns blazing, cutting down anyone who threatened the children. But even as they fought, Silas knew they were running out of time. The guards who'd gone to investigate the explosion would return soon, and reinforcements from the orphanage wouldn't be far behind. "Get the children!" he shouted over the gunfire. "Move them to the horses!" What followed was organized chaos. 20 terrified children, some barely able to walk, had to be loaded onto horses and wagons while gunfire echoed around them. Bear and Elena worked with desperate efficiency, lifting the smaller children onto horseback while the older ones were helped into a captured wagon. "Silas!" Clara's voice cut through the noise. "Riders coming from the east, a lot of them." Through the dust and smoke, Silas could see the approaching torches, at least a dozen riders, probably led by Sheriff Wade himself. They had minutes, maybe less, before being surrounded. "Elena, take point," Silas commanded. "Bear, cover our rear. We're leaving now." As they prepared to flee into the night with their precious cargo, Silas caught sight of a familiar face among the rescued children. Tommy Hartwell, Abigail's brother, was alive and conscious, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and hope. The boy's presence reminded Silas of why they were fighting, why the risk was worth taking. These weren't just statistics or victims. They were individual human beings with names, families, and futures that had been stolen from them. The chase that followed would test every skill they possessed and every bond of trust between them. But for now, in this moment, they had succeeded in the first part of their mission. 20 children were free. The real fight was just beginning. The abandoned mining town of Copper Creek lay 20 miles north of Dodge City, its empty buildings offering temporary shelter for the rescued children and their unlikely protectors. As dawn broke over the Kansas plains, Silas Monroe stood watch while Doc Holliday tended to the children who'd been drugged during their captivity. "Most of them will be fine," Doc reported quietly, his medical bag open beside a makeshift bed where young Tommy Hartwell was slowly regaining consciousness. "But some of the older ones, they've seen things no child should see." Silas nodded grimly. The rescue had been only the beginning. Now they faced the harder task of bringing down the entire network while keeping the children safe from retaliation. Clara Dawson emerged from the telegraph office, her face bearing news both good and troubling. "I've made contact with Federal Marshal William Hayes in Denver. He's been building a case against territorial corruption for months and wants to coordinate with us." "That's the good news," Bear Thompson observed. "What's the bad news?" "Sheriff Wade has put out wanted posters on all of us. Murder, kidnapping, armed robbery. There's a $1,000 bounty on Silas's head alone." Elena Vasquez spat into the dust. "Figured they'd try to make us the criminals. Question is, how long before they track us here?" Their answer came sooner than expected. Deputy Price, who'd been scouting the approaches to town, rode in hard with urgent news. "Company coming," he announced. "Wade's got a posse of about 15 men, including some faces I don't recognize. Professional gunmen by the look of them." "How long?" Silas asked. "Hour, maybe less." Silas surveyed their position. Copper Creek offered some defensive advantages: stone buildings, multiple escape routes, and elevated positions for riflemen. But they were still outnumbered and had 20 children to protect. "Eleanor, Bear, take positions in the old assay office and the hotel. Clara, get the children into the mine shaft at the north end of town. Doc, go with them." "What about you?" Clara asked. "I'm going to end this, one way or another." As his team moved to their positions, Silas checked his weapons and considered his options. The smart play would be to run, to take the children and disappear into the vast emptiness of the frontier. But running wouldn't stop the network, wouldn't save the next group of children, wouldn't bring justice to those who'd profited from human misery. The sound of approaching horses echoed off the canyon walls. Sheriff Wade rode at the head of his posse, his face flushed with anger and determination. Beside him rode a man Silas recognized from Clara's descriptions, Jake Morrison, the bounty hunter who'd delivered Tommy to the staging camp. "Monroe!" Wade's voice carried across the empty street. "You're surrounded. Send out the children and surrender, and maybe we can work something out." Silas stepped into the street, his hands resting casually on his gun butts. "The children stay with us, Wade. They're under federal protection now." Wade's laugh was harsh and bitter. "Federal protection? Boy, you have no idea how deep this goes. The Federals who matter are already in our pocket." "Maybe, but I know one who isn't." As if summoned by his words, the sound of more horses approached from the east. A new group of riders crested the ridge. Federal Marshal William Hayes and 6 deputy marshals, their badges glinting in the morning sun. "Sheriff Wade," Marshal Hayes called out as he rode into town. By the authority of the United States government, you're under arrest for conspiracy, corruption, and trafficking in human beings. Wade's face went white, then red with rage. You have no jurisdiction here, Hayes. This is territorial business. Not anymore. Hayes dismounted, producing a sheaf of official documents. I have warrants signed by a federal judge in Denver. Your operation is finished. For a moment, it seemed like the standoff might end peacefully. Then Morrison made his play, drawing his gun with lightning speed and aiming at Marshal Hayes. But Silas was faster, his Colt clearing leather and barking once. Morrison toppled from his saddle, his shot going wide. The gunfight that followed was brief but decisive. Wade's hired guns, realizing they were outmatched and facing federal charges, began throwing down their weapons. Within minutes, the street was filled with surrendering men and the acrid smell of gunpowder. But the real victory came later, as Marshal Hayes and his men secured the evidence they needed. Clara's documentation, combined with the testimony of the rescued children and the records seized from the staging camp, painted a picture of corruption that reached all the way to the territorial capital. Reverend Barton and his wife are already in custody, Hayes reported as they gathered in the old saloon, along with Judge Blackwood and 3 other territorial officials. The Children's Welfare Foundation has been exposed as a front operation. What about the children? Silas asked. The ones we rescued and the others who might still be out there? We're working with legitimate orphanages and family services across the territory. Every child will be properly placed or reunited with surviving family members. Hayes paused, studying Silas with professional interest. You know, the Federal Marshal Service could use men like you. Men who understand that justice sometimes requires going outside the system. Silas considered the offer. For 25 years, he'd been drifting, carrying the guilt of his sister's disappearance and his failure to save her. Maybe it was time to stop running from his past and start building a future. I'll think about it, he said finally. 3 days later, as the last of the rescued children were placed in safe homes, Silas found himself standing in the Dodge City Cemetery. A new headstone marked the grave of Clara Monroe, his sister, whose disappearance had set him on the path that led to this moment. I'm sorry I couldn't save you, he whispered to the stone. But maybe I saved some others in your memory. Mr. Monroe? A small voice interrupted his thoughts. He turned to see Abigail Hartwell, clean and well-dressed, holding her brother Tommy's hand. They'd been placed with a kind family in Denver, but had returned to Dodge City for the trials. Thank you, Abigail said simply, for keeping your promise. Silas knelt to meet her eyes, seeing in them the hope and trust that had been stolen from so many other children. You're welcome, little miss. You take care of that brother of yours. I will. And Mr. Monroe, Tommy wants to be like you when he grows up, someone who helps people. As the children walked away with their new guardians, Silas felt something he hadn't experienced in decades: peace. The network was broken, the children were safe, and justice had been served. It wasn't perfect justice. Some of the perpetrators would escape punishment, and there would always be other predators, other victims. But for now, in this moment, it was enough. Clara Dawson approached, her notebook tucked under her arm. So what's next for the famous Silas Monroe? Famous? Silas raised an eyebrow. Oh yes, my story about the Dove Creek conspiracy is being picked up by newspapers across the country. You're quite the hero. I'm no hero, just a man who did what needed doing. Sometimes that's the same thing. Clara smiled. Marshal Hayes told me you're considering his offer. Maybe. Seems like there's still plenty of work to be done. There always is. But now you won't be doing it alone. As if to prove her point, Bear Thompson and Elena Vasquez approached, their own decisions made. Well, partner, Bear grinned, looks like we're back in the law enforcement business. Hayes offered us all positions as special investigators. Someone's got to keep you out of trouble, Elena added with a rare smile. Silas looked at his friends, then at the town of Dodge City spread out below them. The corruption had been rooted out, the children were safe, and justice had prevailed. But more importantly, he'd found something he'd thought lost forever: a sense of purpose, a family of choice, and the knowledge that one person could make a difference. All right then, he said, settling his hat on his head. Let's go find some more children to save. As the four unlikely heroes rode out of Dodge City toward their new lives as federal agents, the sun set behind them, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolled, its sound carrying across the plains like a promise that justice, however delayed, would always find a way. The lonely cowboy was lonely no more. He'd found his family among the lost and broken, his purpose in protecting the innocent, and his peace in knowing that Sarah's memory lived on in every child he saved. In the end, that was enough. More than enough. It was everything. Hello? How are you? Did you enjoy the story? Like, share, comment on which city you're watching from, and subscribe to the channel to help us continue adding new amazing videos. Thank you very much, and come back often.